Welcome to Laptop Radio. Today's topic is what everyone gets wrong about blockchain governance. We have Thomas Cox with us. He is the chair of P2145, and Thomas has worked on blockchain governance for 3.5 years, including the initial design of EOS mainnet governance. Hello, Thomas. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. Where are you located?
I'm in Portland, Oregon, in the United
Awesome.
States.
Pretty close by.
Yeah.
And tell us your story.
Yeah. So I got involved in blockchain and distributed ledger governance and the governance of decentralized systems, really, about 3.5 years ago when I started working on the EOS project for Block One. And that turned into a fascination for me. So even after I rolled off that project, just continue to stick with it because it's such an important aspect of decentralized systems, blockchain, other kinds of distributed ledgers, and so on. And I'm noticing, I'm noticing now, people don't really understand what it is or how incredibly important it is to get it right. And the result of that, not quite understanding, is we see project after project getting as far as proof of concept or trying to get initial round of users, second round of users, and they stall out and people don't adopt the system. They don't want to come on board. And ultimately, the reason is they don't see how their own interests are being protected by the way the system is being run. And because so many technologists are focused on technology and governance isn't technology, governance is governance. Governance gets neglected. They build cool tech, users come, but they don't stay. And it's sad. And so we see a lot of projects flounder for this reason. It's not just small projects either, by the way. Trade Lens is this huge system run by Maersk. Maersk is the largest shipping company in the world.
Mhm.
And they spent millions of dollars working with IBM to build out this blockchain-based system. And they couldn't get any of their trade partners to join them for over a year. Now, all the customers would join because the customers didn't have any choice. If you wanted to be a customer of Maersk, you use whatever system they use. But all the trade partners were like, yeah, no. And it just went on and on. It was just this global embarrassment for them. And they finally realized that, oh, yeah, we're claiming it's this decentralized ledger. But the problem was Maersk insisted on running all of the trust nodes themselves. And it's like,
Mhm.
wait, I'm your partner slash competitor, and I'm going to run my company on your system. And it's not a single source of truth; it's Maersk's source of truth. Why would I do that? Of course, I don't. And so finally, they got, oh, gee, okay, how about if we make a different offer where if you want to be a trade partner, you'll run one of the trust nodes and others will run trust nodes, and Maersk will not maintain unilateral control over the truth.
Mhm.
Oh, suddenly 50 companies joined. So it only took me over a year to figure that out.
Yeah.
So people shouldn't feel bad if they are a little slow to the governance game. It's lots of people are, and you've got to get over this because when you want to set up a single source of truth, blockchain-based system, distributed ledger system, what you're really telling people is nobody gets to have their own private truth anymore. Normally, I've got my system, you've got your system, and then we reconcile. We exchange purchase orders or other foreign invoices, and then we reconcile those against payments. And there's these two parallel systems, and there lots of people could spend a lot of dollars and a lot of hours reconciling systems. But with a single shared truth, it's continuous reconciliation. There is no additional step, and it makes for much cleaner, much easier to run solutions. It really solves a lot of problems that people have kind of gotten used to in business. It's wonderful from a business perspective, but it's also a ton of work to set up. And so here's what'll happen. People get partway into building one of these systems and they realize, oh, wait, we have to add to it over time. We have to make technical changes. We have to fix bugs. We want to expand beyond ocean-based freight to aircraft freight. We have to expand the capabilities of the system. Well, you don't get to do that on your own anymore. If anybody's going to do it, everybody has to do it. And maybe one person writes the code, but everyone has to believe in it enough to roll it out. You can't do that on your own. You're going to have to persuade people to add this additional code and to take on the expense of adding the additional code and testing it. So now everything's a committee meeting. Everything's a group decision. You can't roll your own. You can't do your own thing. And it can slow down innovation in some senses.
What are some of the problems that people get wrong about blockchain governance? I feel like no one really understands it.
Right. Well, and that's because it's a single phrase to cover a whole host of topics and challenges. Let's take them one at a time. There's a technology change. Who's going to write the code? Who's going to test the code? Who's going to approve the code? Who has to approve it? How many people have to approve it before we all agree that it's good enough to be brought in and adopted, this bug fix? And in a system like Ethereum, they literally don't know who their own stakeholders are. 2018, I was so excited that the Ethereum folks were doing governance because I was very new to it and I was still felt like I didn't know what I was doing. And gosh, these Ethereum folks were so far ahead of everybody else, and they were going to have this big global governance conference, and they were going to announce all their findings. And I was so excited. And they came out of it and they said, we have two findings. Our two findings are, number one, we have to figure out who our stakeholders are. And then number two, we have to figure out a way to find out what they want. And I said, you are kidding me. You spent 3 days with a global conference and that's as far as you got. That's the definition of governance, people, is knowing who your stakeholders are and how to find out what they want so that you can orchestrate consensus to reach a decision and carry the decision out. And that's what governance is, reaching decisions and carrying them out. And you've got different classes of decisions that have to be handled differently, but they've all got to be made. If you want to be in bed with somebody technologically on a blockchain, you have to be in synchronization with them. You want to fix a bug? Great. Who proposes it? Who fixes it? Who tests the fix? Who says this fix is good enough that this fix does not break anything new? And then what's the process by which we all adopt that code and execute it? You need a system for that. If you've got 3 or 4 or 5 people doing changes, then you're going to need a separate committee to schedule changes, a change management committee. What if you need to make business rule changes separate from technology changes? Like we're going to add some new business area. Now you need a business committee in parallel with the technical committee. You're probably going to need an overarching steering committee to keep all the other committees straight. And if this sounds like a horrific explosion of committees, you are correct. I think kind of hilarious that the earliest adopters of blockchain were primarily anarcho-capitalist lone wolf types, independence oriented, like I'm going to do my own thing and no one can stop me and I'm going to be borderless and I can transact anywhere in the world. The most libertarian, I'm a libertarian myself, the most libertarian minded, least likely to want to be in a committee, join a committee, work on a committee, people in the world champion this technology, and to make it run, it's nothing but committees all day. In a way, it's ironic, but not surprising that the earliest champions also got a lot of this stuff kind of wrong. And so if you are working on a blockchain project, I encourage you to start saying to yourself, to others, so how are we going to keep this thing viable over time? How do we make sure that this shared consensus system, this shared reality, this shared single source of truth is adaptive and responsive to a changing reality quickly, but not whimsically? And how do we make sure that everybody comes along with us and doesn't feel jerked around?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the second thing. You could say, well, gosh, for efficiency, we'll just keep it all centralized.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, come on, man, that's not blockchain anymore. But people are doing that. There's Binance has a business chain. The V chain is the granddaddy for these. It's this sort of vertically oriented, sponsored system that businesses get invited into. And VeChain actually did decentralize their governance. The Binance chain and some of these others totally centralized. All the nodes are run by the sponsor, right? But it's being held up as a blockchain system. And the attraction is if you want to hop on and just start running your business, there's no work, there's no committee meetings. Yay, I just show up and pay my fee and get stuff done.
Mm-hmm.
But you're no longer doing decentralized anything. It's just a very expensive, slow database.
Right.
And you're not getting any of the benefits of decentralization and removing single sources of failure. When you step back from blockchain, what are we really trying to do? We're trying to find new ways for people to cooperate and new ways to cooperate at scale. New ways for two people on different sides of the world who may never meet to engage in transactions with one another and grow to trust one another, but not have to trust one another and not have to trust anybody in the middle. Get rid of middlemen who aren't really adding value. Blockchain technology, distributed ledgers are going to be with us for many decades to come because they do wonderful things for cooperation. But they come at a price. When you want to work in a group, you've got to have to give the group what the group needs, not just what each of the individuals needs. I tell this when I talk to partnerships, when I coach business clients. There's what each partner needs, and then there's what does the organization need? What does each blockchain founder need? What is the blockchain system itself? What does the community need? And the community's needs are different from the individual needs. You can't just aggregate all the individual needs and come up with a group need. The group as a group is its own entity. It has its own emergent requirements, and it isn't always obvious. I would say that the thing that people get wrong about governance is first, they think they don't need it. Second, they think it's going to be easy. And then they think, well, we'll just do on-chain voting. Like that'll solve everything. No, it doesn't even begin to solve everything. And what will typically happen is you've got voting in a proof of stake style system, and then the people with the most stake make all the rules, and the rich people run the system. Well, there you go. It reflects the rest of the world, doesn't it? But it doesn't have to be that way, and maybe it shouldn't be that way. And the good news is that the technology permits you to do lots of other things. You can have one person, one vote, which is vulnerable to Sybil attacks. Then you need strong identity. You can do one interested person, one vote, where people have to put in signs of commit in order to have a say. And there's things like liquid democracy that can do some clever, interesting things. There's really naive approaches like quadratic voting, which is just ludicrous. And so many people think it's great, and it absolutely collapses as soon as you try to actually use it. And outside of a very, very small group, if you've got like 5 friends and you all are committed to, like, we want to prove quadratic voting works, then you can make it work in a group of 5. But when you get up to say 50 or 500, and people are no longer like passionate advocates for quadratic voting as a concept, they're just trying to get work done.
Yeah.
They will immediately undercut it. It is so susceptible to attack that there's no way to maintain its integrity. And the champions don't want to hear it, so they don't want to admit it, so they don't address it. But I guess my main point here is don't just think we'll start voting on stuff and that somehow makes it all work.
What are some of the considerations or factors that project founders or collaborators should think about when they're
I,
designing governance?
Yeah, there's a sequence you should be going through. I've actually got this documented in an infographic that I can share with you if you'd like. But what you want to do is start off and say, what's the purpose of this system? What is the economic or other benefit that it's creating? And who are the primary stakeholders or primary stakeholder classes in that endeavor? And that might be artists and art galleries. I'm just going to make something up. Okay, super. So let's say it's primarily artists and art galleries, and to some extent, maybe art consumers. Okay, what are the differences, qualitative differences that separate artists from art galleries? Well, let's see, artists want to be able to make whatever they want to make. They want to be able to make as much as they want to make, and they'd like lots of distribution. And art galleries want exclusivity with an artist. They don't want the artist to make too much. They don't want to saturate the market. And they like to take as much of the artist funding as they can get away with. And so there's going to be a tussle over exclusivity. They'll be at odds with each other over how much the artist keeps and how much the gallery keeps. You can begin to see how the natural lines of tension begin to reveal themselves. And there's still room for a win-win, but it's not obvious where to draw the line. Is it 80-20? Does the artist keep 80% of the revenue? 50? 35%? The galleries can spend a lot of money trying to promote artists. It's not at all clear what the right balance should be. And worst of all, if you just throw in voting, then guess what? There's 100 artists and 12 studios. All the artists vote in their own favor, and the galleries all get outvoted. They're like, why am I here? There's no point, and they all leave. You can see why that fails. Now, there's some clever ways around that. If you've done step 1, which is identify your economic value, and then step 2 is look at your classes of users and how do those different groups or classes or user types, how do they naturally want to cooperate and how do they naturally have tension with each other. Then you go on to step 3 and say, how do I create a system of decision-making rights where I can allocate those rights in a way that is stable over time and ensures that there's enough give and take that nobody takes advantage of anyone else. And I'll tell you exactly how a particular chain did that. One of my favorite examples, they're called Grain Chain. And what Grain Chain does is it unites agricultural workers, farmers, with agricultural commodity buyers. There's a third group of agricultural clearinghouses. Those are typically grain silos and grain storage facilities. And then there's a fourth group of banks and other financing institutions. And what they managed to do was come up with a governance system whereby each group gets one vote. The groups have to get together to figure out which way what the group is going to cast its one vote. And then when each group casts its one vote, they have to agree unanimously or nothing happens. It has the elegance that you can't have two groups gang up on a third group.
Mhm.
It's either we all agree or nothing happens. And so they're very inclined to propose very carefully balanced changes that address everyone's needs. And it seems to be working very, very well. Other aspects that are working for GrainChain, by the way, I just love bragging about them, is they've removed the grain silo operators from being middlemen. They use Internet of Things devices to measure the grain when it arrives. The commodity buyer gets an exact snapshot of precisely what she or he is buying. So there's no mystery anymore. And they can buy it immediately and take ownership while it still sits there in storage. The farmers, instead of getting paid 90 days after they harvest, can get paid within a couple of hours after dropping things off. Obviously, that's a huge acceleration of payout. And then the banks love it because the bank can lend money to the farmer, have it secured against the value of the crop that's going to be harvested. And then the smart contracts pay the bank off as soon as the grain is bought by the commodity buyer. The farmer doesn't have to cut the bank a check. The bank gets paid automatically, which reduces their risk substantially, which means they can lower their rates because you don't have to pay such a high rate if the risk is lower. So it's a complete win on all directions. Even the silo operators like it because they're no longer caught in between trying to talk the farmer down by telling him the quality is low and simultaneously talk the price up to the commodity buyer by claiming the quality is high. They're just neutral holders of objects in space. And they let the IoT devices tell all parties what the quality is and what it's worth. Or well, but the market tells you what it's worth. And so what governance lets you do is build these multi-sided marketplaces that solve real world problems in ways that are sustainable and flexible and can change over time without opening you up to dishonest attacks and people ganging up on one another, all the artists voting against the gallery because you mistakenly gave everyone the same kind of vote and so forth. Governance is the way groups make decisions. Governance is the way groups execute those decisions. And governance is the way groups change their decision-making methods over time. And so the downside is the decentralized future contains a whole lot more committee meetings, sorry. But the good news is that the future contains a lot of opportunity for much greater cooperation across much larger numbers of people without empowering intermediaries, without empowering middlemen, without having our power taken away from us. And to me, that's tremendously exciting. And it means we're going to make, I think, a much better future.
What happens when there's no decision being made, like when something is stuck in the governance system? In governance and other decisions, sometimes there's a majority vote or a quorum. In a blockchain governance system, I'm just wondering what happens if there's no quorum.
Well, nothing happens. That's a challenge. And by the way, that's a real problem. In fact, the original DAO hack, the anniversary is coming up here in June of the great DAO hack that led to Ethereum and Ethereum Classic splitting apart. That had a voting mechanism in it. And they were trying to get people to cast their votes on chain to make this hack stop. And they could not get more than 10 or 12% of people to vote. They're in a crisis, an existential crisis where you're going to lose all your money. And they couldn't get more than 10 or 12% of people to show up to vote. It's horrific. And so that's a real problem of people not showing. And that's one of the reasons why it's important to have a delegation system where people can delegate their vote to an agent who will vote on their behalf, or a proxy system that does the same thing. And you have to design things so that if people don't vote, something intelligent happens, something wise happens. Either that person gets disenfranchised, or maybe the system just fails. Maybe you train people to show up to vote, or you make it a lot easier than it was. The DAO hack voting was very, very difficult. But you are going to have to solve that because people have an incentive to abstain from voting if they can get away with it. The Australian approach is to require voting and issue a fine if people don't vote. But yeah, you will have a risk of low participation. And that if there's a low participation vote, the result may not execute if there's an automatic minimum turnout required, or it might mean that the result is unrepresentative because some tiny but very motivated subset got in there and they all voted, nobody else did. And by the way, the reason why the United States banned alcohol for several years, called prohibition, no more than 10% of the population was ever in favor of prohibition, but it passed as a constitutional amendment. Now, how on earth do you do that? And the answer is that the prohibition proponents would go to local and regional politicians, and whoever came in a close second in any race, they would approach that person and say, if you will pledge to support our agenda, we will pledge to support you in the next election. And so they got these pledges from all these politicians of all parties who owed their position to getting this like 5-10% of the vote on their side. And they were able to roll that up to a national piece of legislation that had far-reaching negative consequences. And so a committed minority can dramatically affect policy outcomes, even in a federated system with checks and balances. You got to be aware of that when you design your system.
And then also regarding hostile takeovers and different attacks on the governance system, what are some of these possible emergencies that projects might have to tackle when
Right.
they're running the governance?
Well, I think you can just look around and see examples kind of all over the place. I mean, private chains are less susceptible than public, but they've all got a risk of technology failure, a risk of hacks, a risk of theft, a risk of various kinds of external features, forces, attributes, people trying to shut the thing down, people trying to take advantage of the system that would force you to respond. And one of the ways of handling that, by the way, is to set up an executive who can take emergency action that has to then be validated. And if they take an emergency action that's the majority later decides wasn't okay, that executive can be punished and fired. But if you're looking for, what are examples of the kinds of things people have to respond to, the DAO hack is probably the best example. We've seen multiple attacks in Ethereum-based systems from hackers of all sorts. We've seen exchanges hacked and tokens stolen. There's also data exfiltration issues. If it's a private blockchain used for business, there can be some really valuable data hiding in there, and competitors might pay money to get that data smuggled out so they can discover your pricing or your traffic patterns of who your customers are. And so those are all examples of things that are a risk. Having customer information stolen, having customer assets stolen are examples. We live in an increasingly technological world. We're more and more dependent on more and more overlapping systems. And so you're going to have to make sure that if you want people to rely on your system, that you can respond rapidly in a crisis without creating a mechanism that allows someone to seize control unjustly. It's not easy.
How important is to have internal control, not just on the governance side of it on chain, but also off chain? I'm referring to the human aspect as well as
Yes,
the operation of the business aspect.
right. Just so you're aware, everyone talks about on-chain and off-chain governance, and it can be a little bit of a distraction, in my opinion. The only things that really need to be on-chain, in my opinion, are the results of votes and the text of things being voted on. And that's even if you have a voting system, or the minutes of meetings, because those need to be shared sources of truth, shared reality. Beyond that, we've got one of the more popular systems out there is being used widely in US national defense. And I'm forgetting the name of the system. They have no governance on chain at all. All of their systems are private.
Mhm.
They're all permissioned, and all their governance methods are laid out on paper in contracts between the businesses who are coming together to run these chains. And so it's a shared ledger, but the governance is totally off chain. With Grain Chain, only the initiatives to be voted on and the outcomes of the votes are on chain. V Chain is very, other people want to have all the debates on chain, and they want to have automatically rolling forward changes where the code being voted on is on chain. And if enough people vote for it, then it automatically executes whether you like it or not, which brings up the possibility that someone could propose a change that has a hidden bug in it. The testing doesn't reveal the bug, people vote in favor of it, it automatically rolls forward. And as soon as it starts to execute, the chain is bricked or starts to malfunction or some exploit happens. And so automatic code execution has, some real risks to it as well as some. I'm a big believer in only putting on chain the things you need to, but definitely putting on those things on chain. Some things can never be automated. Making up your own mind or deciding you're going to have faith in this governance system.
Yeah.
That's a human decision.
Yeah, I'm a really big privacy person. I think it's important for projects to look at privacy points
Yes.
and think about what needs to be online, what needs to be offline or off the chain, even in private databases, so
Right.
that decisions could be made, and then design the governance structure or design with privacy in mind. Another question that I have for you is, I think in the community there's a confusion between consensus and governance, and I think governance and consensus is different. What is your perspective about consensus, and how is it similar to governance, and how do they overlap?
Right.
And yeah.
So consensus has at least two meanings. One is a sort of a colloquial meaning where if you and I and Fred and Barney all agree where we're going to go to lunch, then we will say in English, we've reached consensus on where to have lunch. And that's one kind of consensus. And then there's another much more technical use of the term, meaning what is in the block. And someone's proposed a block, but then we all have to, come to consensus on the state of the chain, come to consensus on what is in the next block. And that is has to be automated. It's high end. It's the subject of much research and much discussion on what's the best way to do that and who should do what, when, how, why. And I'm not competent to walk people through the ins and outs of making those decisions. That's pretty involved stuff. But for most of what we're talking about, consensus is automated. If you want to run an Ethereum, EOS, Bitcoin derivative, you want to run a side chain, you want to run a node on an existing network, the consensus mechanism's already been decided. And a lot of great research has been done in that. And there's really nothing you and I need to do in terms of picking or choosing or tweaking or configuring. You just find what's in use that's appropriate and you use it. And you're much more likely to join an existing chain than you are to start a new one most of the time. So the technical consensus, people talk about it at great length, especially people who are really, really into that kind of thing. It's just not that important. Once it works well enough, it's time to look at other things.
Yeah, no, I've been to many different blockchain conferences led by experts. I think they still get confused between those two.
Yeah, and they talk about it like it's some big deal that you must care and you must know all these details. And it's like, yeah, it's get it that it's important to you.
Yeah, but and it's so different. I'm just like, well, that's not governance. That's your consensus protocol.
It's more of a technical
Yeah.
issue, frankly.
And with regards to the execution of governance,
Yeah.
of course, people make decisions, but who is going to execute on these decisions? And so
Yes.
the question is really, who should execute?
And that's really part of governance design, in my opinion. Do you have a small executive that carries out things at the direction of a larger deliberative board? There's a reason why that model has come up again and again in the evolution of human systems, that we create deliberative bodies of many people with lots of representation and lots of different perspectives, and they come up with a direction, and then that's handed to an agent to execute. A chairman gives instructions from the board to a CEO. The legislature passes a law and then tells the executive, the president, to make that happen. And it's not a bad system. It obviously has many, many flaws because we're humans, but there's reasons why that structure keeps being repeated. And so I think you should try what works for you and what your user base would like and what people are willing to agree to. Because if I used to think that the primary deliverable of a governance system was decisions and decision execution. I used to think that all the time, and I used to say that a lot. And I don't think that anymore. I think the real deliverable of a governance system is a sense of legitimacy in the minds and the hearts of the humans who are associated with that system. That if the governance system has legitimacy, then its decisions are valid. And then even if I don't like the decision or I've wanted to vote the other way, we followed our process. Other people had more votes than me. My interests are still being protected. I'll go along with that. I won't just exit the system entirely. And without legitimacy, the entire game collapses. When a majority of the users or the stakeholders look at the decision-making process and they say, yeah, this thing's corrupt. I don't believe in these decisions. I don't think they were made honestly. I don't think they're being carried out faithfully. I think this thing's a big game that's being played at my expense. They start looking for the exit. And it's not a shared source of truth that people do that. And if it's a physical system you can't exit, like the government of your town or country, and let's say you can't leave it, or it's very, very awkward to leave it, you might then start looking for a way to replace that regime, either through elections or other means. So legitimacy is a prerequisite for cooperation at scale.
Let's move to fraud and misrepresentation, internal and external. How could governance be used to detect?
With difficulty, if you look at the natural world, look at animals, look at insects, look at even bacteria. The living world is filled with organisms that are lying to each other all the time. Right? Now, they also have to communicate the truth to each other as well. And so there's this whole signal detection problem going on constantly.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if it's a species with both males and females and they want to reproduce, then they have to find each other and signal to each other that they'd like to get together and create more life. But then there's predators out there who might want to pretend to be either a male or a female and lure you in and then devour you. And so, gosh, how do you tell that apart? And so if insects and bacteria are lying to each other and fooling each other and engaging in this like escalating war, well, you think humans are going to be exempt from that? No, of course not. There will always be people trying to commit fraud, either because they showed up wanting to do that or they showed up intending to be honest, but then they saw an opportunity and decided that they were being morally flexible that day. And then they go from being trustworthy to not trustworthy because they've changed their decisions. And I think the best thing that any of us can hope for is a system that makes it easy to detect fraud and hard to escape the consequences. And so for me, that would include things like having people post performance bonds, having people post what their guarantee of results is when they make an offer, having a clear dispute resolution mechanism, hopefully on chain, where party A and party B are transacting and it says on the chain that they agree to binding arbitration as provided by the blockchain arbitration association, or I don't know if there's such a thing. Somebody,
Yeah, dispute
you know,
resolution and oracles.
yeah. And I think that, by the way, I will say, I personally believe that a lot of the on-chain dispute resolution mechanisms that attempt to be automated, like Aragon Court and Claros, I think they're really naive and I don't trust them. And I wouldn't put anything of a value of mine through such a system because they reward the jurors, but they do random juries, which I love, but the jurors are rewarded for voting whichever way the final vote went. It's like, okay, so it's just a rush to judgment. It's just what do I think everybody else thinks everybody else thinks?
It's like social
As
media.
opposed to what's truth and what's justice, like what's fair. It's like, no, we don't care about fair. We just care about popularity. Oh, shoot. Well, come on, man. That
Yeah.
ain't justice. And I don't want to put myself at the risk of that.
Yeah, I think our justice system has become very social media like, which is really bad. Like we don't really look at the details and the facts. We basically
Yeah.
look at how many users people have, and then we vote because they're popular. It's really bad.
Yeah. And who most needs justice? The people who are least popular
Yes.
who most need justice. And so having justice be a function of popularity just seems ludicrous to me. But you could probably make it work in a small group if people really are committed to justice in the group. But you try to scale that up to a larger mass population, I despair of that having any success at all. And I can be proven wrong. Just because I'm skeptical doesn't mean it won't work. I just don't believe in it. And so, yeah, if you want to protect people from fraud, one of the ways to protect yourself against fraud is to break transactions from one big transaction that can be stolen into several small transactions, right? If you're going to buy let's say you had enough money to buy 10 Bitcoin. That's a lot of money. Okay, so maybe you buy them one at a time or buy them a half of one at a time. And only when they successfully deliver do you then buy the next one. And that can be done pretty quickly and pretty inexpensively online. You're not introducing a lot of complexity or a lot of delay, but you're lowering your risk. Because if they take your third payment and run away, well, that's a fraction of what you were going to be spending. It's when you do large single transactions that you put yourself at greater risk of misappropriation and theft.
Let's discuss a little bit about governomics, because I think the integration of the tokens inside the governance system could be a little bit complicated. And
You think a little.
what is governomics? And why should we care?
At this point, I don't think we do. I think having a governance token right now, today in 2021, is primarily just another way to create a token that might fluctuate in price and become an object of speculation.
Mhm,
There are very few governance tokens that actually are used to govern anything. The
mhm.
vast majority are used as speculative vehicles. And to me, that's just using the word governance as a label because it's the label of the day. It's the popular term. It's got nothing to do with actually making decisions.
Okay, got it.
Uh,
So farming, yield farming, and all that.
yeah,
Ooh,
yeah, yield farming. Oh,
okay.
please. Yeah, there's an important distinction between Ponzi schemes and Ponzi games. A Ponzi scheme is a dishonest attempt to defraud people by lying about their returns and paying off early investors with the deposits of later investors. A Ponzi game is an above board honest game that's a zero sum game, and people speculate and gamble, and they all know the rules going in. And here's an utterly worthless token that now suddenly has value and it seems to be going up. Would you like to buy some? And then people say, yeah, I want to buy some because there's going to be someone even dumber than me in about 5 minutes and I'll sell it to him at a higher price. And that keeps going until it stops. And then when the music stops, the last people holding the token are left holding the bag.
Yeah, let's talk about the participation of the governance tokens and what's a proper way to use governance tokens, if any.
Well, I don't know if there's any one proper way. Every system has to decide for itself how it wants to be run. The architects, the designers have to come up with something, and then the people who take it over have to continue it or change it. And a governance token is just a thing you use to exert decision-making powers over some realm of decision choices. And that's up to you as the designer. How what can you need different kinds of tokens for different kinds of decisions? Is it all tokens are created equal? Does a token an NFT? Do you attach a token to an individual person and give it one person, one vote? The sky's the limit in terms of human creativity to solve these problems. And so if you want to get away from speculative tokens that are just labeled governance tokens, and you want to get into the realm of actually using tokens as a tool for carrying out governance activities, man, we've barely scratched the surface of what could be done there.
Yeah, yeah.
I'd love to see somebody come up with a secret ballot system that actually runs well on blockchains. Because right now, all voting is, number one, you can see the votes as they're happening,
Yeah.
which means you can game the vote. And then you can see who voted which way, which I don't know that it's being used too heavily on people yet, but it could be used in the future to intimidate people to vote the way that you want them. And the secret ballot has been in use for thousands of years for the very good reason that the only way to find out what people really think is to keep them safe from consequences so that they can tell you the truth. And so the old Greek method, by the way, which I think is maybe amenable to tokenization, you'd be handed two physical tokens. One had a hole drilled through it and the other did not. And you would hold it in your fingers so that your finger and thumb covered where the hole would be. And so someone looking at you just saw you holding these two objects and they couldn't tell which one had the hole, which is the yes vote, and which one didn't, which was the no vote. And you'd walk up and you'd put one of these things into the urn to be counted, and the other would go into this discard urn. And literally no one but you know which way you voted.
That's awesome.
And token-based voting, baby. Cutting edge from 1000 BC.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That would be super.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Is there anything else you wanted to share that I have not asked you?
Just that I think the governance is tremendously important. That the group that I'm chairing, P2145, is an IEEE standards Association, a working group. We're liaising with another group called ISO TC 307. Their working group 5 has done just wonder progress on coming up with a standardized dictionary of terms to use to talk about governance in a standardized way so that when we talk about it, we're all using the same words to mean the same things,
Big language, yeah.
which is a very important early step in having useful conversations that have shared meaning. That's one thing I'm involved with, and folks who are interested in helping, we'd love to have you. It's an open process, and just get in touch. Just do a search online for P2145 and you should be pretty easy to find us. That's one thing I wanted to mention. And the other is, if there's a project out there that would like some free advice, I'm happy to give any project 30 minutes of my time for one time to talk over governance design, governance ideas. I think it's tremendously important, and I'd like to make sure everyone has access to some good advice. And if you want to ever go beyond that, I can connect you with resources. I can suggest other folks, as well as I can be retained for a modest fee. So there's that.
Awesome. Thank you, Thomas. And then also, what is one piece of advice that you have for the community?
I would say my advice is that it's time to take governance seriously. You can't have a collective, you can't have a functioning group without group decision making. And that is governance. So start getting used to the word, start getting used to the work of it. Decide for yourself where you're going to invest your own scarce time and attention in governing some parts of your life, because you can't sit on every committee everywhere. And so get to know what's going on. If you're looking at maybe investing in a project or joining one, ask hard questions about their governance design, because if they haven't put proper thought into it, it's probably doomed. And there's no point wasting your time.
Awesome. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
All righty, take care. Bye.
Bye.